Hi, I'm Murray Mandrick, political columnist for the Regina Leader Post, and welcome to our third episode of Campaigniacs. Actually, the first episode, well, there's an actual campaign going on that started just yesterday. With me today are Arthur White-Crummey of the Leader Post, who was very busy covering campaign events yesterday, and Phil Tank of the Star Phoenix, who will be doing the same today because everybody's moving up to Saskatoon, which I think is going to be the pattern that we're going to see throughout this campaign. Back and forth to Regina, Saskatoon, another Highway 11 campaign, which kind of makes me a little sad. I like the days when they got out. But I want to start with the launch yesterday, Arthur, because you covered the launch yesterday, and you've actually covered both Opposition Leader Ryan Miley and Premier Scott Moe for a little while. I found some really stark differences in terms of how they presented themselves on the opening day of the campaign, starting with Moe maybe being a little less of that earthy, straightforward Scott Moe guy that we've seen. A guy that offered a lot of answers that sounded awful political to me, which is not his strength. And I saw a really different Ryan Miley yesterday, far more feisty, and you wonder where in the hell that guy has been for the last 2 years, 6 months, 2 months. Let's start with Scott Moe. Am I right there? Did you sense?
Yeah, I think that he definitely came out swinging, and we saw him really launching into some political attacks, which at time, like, it's clear that he's trying to paint a picture here of two choices that voters have to make, and he wants to fight this battle exclusively on the economic recovery. Now, in order to do that, he's really going back in time and trying to use the NDP's past as a cudgel against the NDP's present. He was going back and looking at hospital and school closures from back in the 1990s. At the same time, he's also trying to cast Ryan Miley as a reckless spender. And it's interesting to see how those two twin attacks are going to sort of cohere with each other.
Do they work? Like, do you sense something that is going to grab hold of the voters? Because I think they work for the base. I think they work for people that have already made up their minds. And when you've got 2/3 of the vote, maybe that's what he was going for. I don't know. But I'm a little curious as to why everyone thinks he would have announced the campaign in this particular way in the middle of a Regina riding, where maybe that doesn't resonate as much. Maybe there's other issues like COVID-19, like other things that are more top of mind to voters than what happened 13 or 16 years ago or 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that a lot of people are thinking about Lauren Calvert and Roy Romano right now. They, as you said, probably have more pressing issues on their mind. But this is the contrast that Moe is trying to paint. And I think the choice of where he made the announcement was instructive. And he told us exactly why he was doing it. He was just outside of Harbor Landing, and he wanted to use that as a symbol of the growth of Saskatchewan under the Saskatchewan Party. And again, comparing that with what he framed as the NDP dismal record of decline. I don't know how much the Sask Party can take credit for the construction of Harbor Landing, but it seemed at times that he was trying to do that.
Well, a good question. I think it was a great, I think it was his best point in yesterday's announcement, and far better than the point about we're status quo, but we should be all excited about that. If you look across that field to what wasn't there before 13 years ago when the NDP were in power, well, it wasn't Harbor Landing. It was actually where they dumped the snow and the junk and from Regina. So, like, I mean, that is progress. And I think the more you associate the Sask Party with progress and population growth and advancement, probably the better. That is problematic for Ryan Miley. But I saw Ryan Miley come out squarely aiming at Scott Moe, a lot feistier, which is what many people in the party had encouraged him to do long before. Why in the hell did he wait to the campaign to do this?
Well, I mean, we've heard this kind of messaging from Miley before. I think you're right that it was a little bit more forceful, a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more cutting than it has been. But it's the same case that he's been making every time you find a moment to talk to him in the lead up to this campaign. He's saying you have a choice between cuts and investment. We're offering investment. The Sask party is going to go back to what they tried to do in 2017 when they had to balance an even less severe budget deficit. He also came out trying to criticize Mo's status quo approach as boring, uninspiring, totally inadequate for the scale of the challenge that we're now facing. One thing that he also tried to do that I'm not sure that we've heard enough of yet is to try to undermine the Sask party's credibility on the economy. Yeah. He says people are struggling and the government is ignoring them. But as of now, I'm not sure how much that's going to stick so long as we have the lowest unemployment rate in the country and we are the closest to our pre-pandemic employment levels. And that's something that Mo really stressed during his campaign launch event, and I think is going to carry him really far.
This is a good point to bring Phil in the conversation, because I've always thought you got a better sense of Saskatchewan from a Saskatoon perspective than Regina, because Regina tends to be too close to government and too close to a lot of things that tend to be political. The everyday meat and potatoes issues, I think, resonate in both cities, but maybe in Saskatoon, where it's less of a government town. Now, Mo is making an announcement today related to a home improvement tax credit. Sounds a little bit like a 1980s deal, but I actually think it's a great move. Like, I mean, that's Mo's brand. He's the guy that's the average guy. I'm fixing up my home. I'm doing this. Am I wrong here? Do you think that works as well as it could possibly in a city like yours, where it's suburban, people really want to move forward and on with their lives and get past this election and COVID and on to the next thing?
Yeah, it probably is a good announcement here. It's interesting that they have that he and Miley have competing announcements at the same time this morning. So I do think both parties see this as a battleground, that they both would like to make gains. There was some close contests back in 2016, and there's some veteran NDP MLAs who are retiring. So I think the Sask party is viewing Saskatoon as a fertile place. I'd just like to mention that the Sask party does focus on the NDP from the 1990s, but I do think that the rural hospital closures still resonate.
I think they do so.
Yeah. So, but it's interesting that Miley made an announcement on Friday here in Saskatoon about their plan for rural healthcare, and was sort of starting to hit Mo on cuts and reductions of rural healthcare under this government. And of course, when I asked him, of course, whenever the NDP mentions rural healthcare, they're going to talk about the hospital closures. And he actually referred back to the Devine government and said, well, of course, the Romano government inherited a financial mess from the Devine government, and clearly connecting the Sask party, which doesn't like to talk about its past in the progressive conservatives of that era very much, but does love to talk about the NDP under Roy Romano.
Well, I'd like to explore that a bit more for a second. It's interesting because I get how firming up your base with the legend of the 52 hospital closures in rural Saskatchewan, plus the Plains Health Center in Regina, still has a lot of cachet in rural Saskatchewan, that people are still angry about it, with a perhaps older electorate around there. They're going to remember it longer, and they're certainly going to hang on to issues like this. And I think it's one of the big reasons why the NDP just absolutely can't get traction outside the cities. And but I'm curious what you said, like, how does that sort of resonate here we go, in Saskatoon, where there is more of a dynamic city that has 4 hospitals, including the new Jim Pattison Children's Center. What kind of works there do you think in terms of Scott Moe reminding them about the past NDP? Is it just because it's also a reminder, hey, the city's building and growing under our government? And do you remember what it was like under the NDP?
Yeah, I do think, I mean, to have this bright, shiny new children's hospital, and I should point out, and not have the North Battleford Hospital, which has been plagued with issues. Obviously that happened under this government. Not sure it would not have happened if the NDP was in charge. So, but it is something that probably in voters' minds, like, yeah, hey, we have this new hospital, and of course it's a children's hospital, which is it's hard to lose with building a children's hospital. So yeah, those are sort of issues that do resonate here.
Where does Miley's message resonate in Saskatoon? Being a bit more of a stinging message, a bit more of an attack on government. I get it in Regina because there's areas in the northern suburbs that are, where people are kind of struggling because of COVID and because of the federated co-op lockout and a few other issues. Where would Miley's strategy of directly attacking Moe be most effective in Saskatoon and maybe the northern half, or the more northern half of the province that you're more familiar with? What's he going for there, do you think?
Well, it's an uncertain time right now, right? And it's hard to even say, because we know some restaurants have closed, we know some businesses have closed, we know, like I did lots of stories during the pandemic about, and I always made sure to ask, how many employees did you lay off and how many did you bring back, and that sort of thing. So it's tough to say. I mean, to say that we have the lowest unemployment rate in the country is still, there's still are people suffering, out there, and I don't think we have a full sense of what that's like yet, right, for some people. So some people might be saying, yes, I'm struggling, but those same people might say, I don't know if a change in government is going to solve this, right? Because people are aware that this is not, the Sask Party's doing, and the NDP will not solve the pandemic either, right? Like some scientist with a vaccine is going to solve it at some point.
Are we still? It's interesting, guys. Are we still on the cusp of change in this province? Because when I talk to people, what I think they're looking for is sort of a return to how good times were in 2008, 2009, when oil prices were high. Obviously, that might not happen ever again. Quite likely might not happen in our lifetime. But is there a sense in in the cities that people do want that steady as she goes Scott Moe thing, or are people, do you sense, starting to feel it a bit more and offering Miley an opportunity to speak to voters in his message that things aren't great and we can do better than Scott Moe is offering us with the status quo? Arthur, what's your thoughts first?
Well, whenever you push Scott Moe about his status quo vision and ask why people should be inspired about it, he starts talking about the growth plan, and he starts talking about things like population growth and job growth and sending our exports all around the world and focusing on these commodity based industries like food, fuel, and fertilizer. You hear him say all the time. So I think that there is a sense that he loves the alliteration. It seems like they are trying to recapture that magic of the boom years, and status quo, steady as she goes, doesn't mean more of 2020 by any means. The Sask Party wants to convince you that it means a return to the good years under Brad Wall. So I think that that's very much alive. So long as we're talking about the past, though, which is something that we did hear a lot about yesterday. One thing I found very interesting in the government announcement today, sorry, not the government announcement, the Sask Party announcement, about the home renovation tax credit, is that they explicitly excluded jacuzzis.
Yes, isn't that funny?
which will not be part part of the home renovation tax credit offering. You will not be able to get money back for your jacuzzi. And it seems like they are preemptively trying to safeguard themselves from some of the criticism that the Grant Devine government faced for their expensive home renovation plan way back in the day. So that's interesting. And it seems like both parties are trying to fight a battle over affordability here, which I think speaks to some of the anxieties that Phil was talking about. So even if people aren't necessarily going to blame the Sask party for the pandemic-driven economic downturn, they are looking for help. And both parties are trying to offer that. The Sask party already through this home renovation tax credit, and we're likely to hear other offerings in the same vein, and the NDP already through those SGI rebate checks, right? So I think that we're going to hear more announcements in that vein in order to respond to some of those anxieties.
Is this just a middle class election, Phil? Like, I mean, is it just one that's going to be fought on middle class issues like that?
Well, I was just going to mention the mayoral campaigns in both cities are taking place at the same time. And there's a lot of talk about 0% property. I believe Michael Fougere in Regina has said he wants a 0% property tax increase. A lot of people are really skeptical here. We have Don Atchison from the boom years trying to remind people how good things were under him, and he's promising pledging a 0% property tax increase. So it is, I do get the sense that the people who are out there door knocking, and of course some of the municipal candidates have been ahead of the provincial ones, are hearing concerns about affordability from the middle class, from the suburbs. You know, the suburbs in Saskatoon is generally considered Sask party territory. So, but there are concerns about affordability, you know, again, because of the pandemic, right? Like people have less money, they're more cautious with their money, they're put off big purchases, that sort of thing. So I do think that's probably the case.
Well, let's talk about that in terms of the next segment in Campaigniacs this week, because you were talking about racial inequality. And I think that actually ties indirectly to economic inequality and such. What did you find out in your interviews, in your piece? And tell us a little bit about it before you introduce it before the next segment, Phil.
Yeah, well, I spoke to Rhonda Rosenberg, who's the executive director of the Multicultural Council of Saskatchewan, and Cowessess First Nation chief Cadmus Delorme. And what was interesting is that we reported on a poll earlier this month where people mentioned the top issues for them, and of course healthcare was number one, followed by the economy, followed by education, and nothing else was real. So no one mentioned racism, racial equality, which is kind of surprising when we saw the reaction to Black Lives Matter and all those people marching. You'd think someone would have said, racial equality and that sort of thing. So, but what Rhonda Rosenberg said, what she'll say in the next segment is that, all of those issues have to be looked at through a racial lens, right? Through it, is healthcare, because they all affect people. I mean, we know that, we've had I almost said the premier, the Saskatchewan party leader, Scott Moe, when he was premier, acknowledge that there is racial inequality, that there is systemic racism in the province. And so that's the sort of things we were talking about in the next segment. Also, I'd like to point out that I asked the parties, what their slate of candidates looks like in terms of diversity. And the NDP, that's kind of their bread and butter issue, diversity. So they have 23% Indigenous candidates and another 7 who are visible minorities. The Sask party gave me 9 names of people who were like visible minorities or Indigenous. So, and that's getting close to where the population is, right? There's about 11% in the last census, about 11% visible minorities and about 70% who claim Indigenous heritage. So the parties are doing a better job of reflecting, the real face of Saskatchewan right now.
Do you think it'll be a big campaign issue or a issue at all? Because I think, as you point out, it's going to be a bigger issue for the NDP to try and make it an issue than it is for the Sask party to perhaps be worried about that it's going to cost them votes, to be completely crass about it.
Well, I'm not sure we're going to talk about, and again, it's surprising that we're not going to talk about races. We might talk about police oversight. There might be that seems to be an issue that you can put some pressure on the Sask party on, because I think that's probably one that most people want. Regardless of what your feelings about racial inequality or anything like that. So it could creep in ways like that into the campaign, I think.
Okay. Well, I'll get out of the way and move forward with your piece because it sounds fascinating. A great job as usual, Arthur. Phil, thank you so much. And I guess we'll see you next week, or we'll see someone next week, or we'll see you on the campaign trail. Good luck.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
Welcome back to Campaigniacs. I'm here with Rhonda Rosenberg, the Executive Director of the Multicultural Council of Saskatchewan, and Chief Cadmus Delorme of the Cowessess First Nation. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the state of racial equality in the province. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, to start off with, I'm going to take us back to this summer, something we all remember. In the wake of the killing of George Floyd in the States, we saw protests, rallies here in Saskatchewan as well, and around the world. I want to ask you both what you thought about that. Rhonda, why don't you go first?
Okay. So I thought that I thought that it was really interesting what kinds of things can really begin to mobilize people. And I think that to some extent, the combination of COVID-19 and the inequity of how it's impacting different people, combined with the sheer inhumanity of the video that we saw of George Floyd's murder, really combined to mobilize people. And we saw in the communities of African descent and many of our members that there was a real desire to both have those public rallies that took place, and also to meet with politicians and talk about what kinds of policy change would really be important to actually affect people's lives in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Just to add on to it, I sense that quit apologizing and quit saying we're sorry or someone's sorry, and start changing behavior, start addressing the core policies. This country, and United States included, was built at a time when very male dominated, very pale faced, and we really see it today in 2020. And these movements, they're emotional. I believe many people could relate to, not just racial based, but even gender. We're in interesting times, and I think Canada is at a good place in Saskatchewan to make change, but it's the fear of unknown on who's going to make that change and who is going to stand up and be that true champion.
We're heading into a provincial election next month, we all expect. What would you like to hear from the parties on the issues of racial equality in the lead up?
I think one of the things that I would like to hear is that there is a demonstrated commitment to work with people at the grassroots and like leadership, like elected Indigenous leadership levels, that I think that's a really key thing to figure out how to move forward. That it's not just about thinking about what's going to fly well in the polls, but talking to the people who are impacted most and about their ideas to move forward. I mean, we just saw Tristan Jerosha was on the lawn of the legislature for about a month and a half, and the indicating a real willingness to listen to people impacted by a variety of different issues, and thinking about what can we do with policy and programs in order to, and even in terms of who's involved in decision making in order to actually affect change.
In 2017, there was a study done Out of all decision makers in this province, there's about 260 decision makers in this province, and less than 3% at that time were of Indigenous descent. And when I read that report, it really shows how much Saskatchewan has to adjust. The Indigenous people, the first people, and I say Indigenous as First Nations, Métis. Inuit are not really in this province, but we have some that have traveled from outside to in, and we have to adjust that to 2020. So when we talk about equality, we talk about decision makers. Cowessess right now, we're working with the province on child welfare. Cowessess First Nation, we're doing renewable energy products with Sask Power. So the willingness is there. The opportunities are there. But when you read the Saskatchewan growth plan, when you just look outside your window and you see the change that is made, we have to understand that we all have to put down our shields and start talking about the elephants in the room in this province. Dear friend and hero of mine, Tristan, in understanding in the north, there is a true suicide epidemic. And, we can't just call Saskatchewan a great place and ignore the north. In the south part of Saskatchewan, we have 34 First Nations in the south. We have a lot living in the city. So as a chief, I'm definitely centric of the Indigenous perspective at this time. But, this province has potential, and I see the change wanting to happen. I've talked with ministers, I've talked with the premier, and no one is opposing it. I just sense that it's who's going to be those true champions to actually start adjusting it.
Yeah, and I'm gonna read you some statistics from the last census done in Saskatchewan. It shows that 11% of the people here are visible minorities, 17% identify as having Aboriginal ancestry. I just wanted to get your response to that. Do you think, I think that's probably reflected more in the cities than it is in other areas, but of course there is the northern Saskatchewan as well. Do you think people realize just how diverse a province we're becoming?
I think people who are living in urban areas certainly do, because the you just have to go to the grocery store or walk around the park to see the face of Saskatchewan has really changed. So I think people are. One of the things I find really interesting is statistically, Saskatchewan has a far greater percentage of newcomers moving into small communities than most of the country does. So even in smaller centers, that there are far more newcomers, and we know that Indigenous people, both First Nations and Métis, live in urban centers, big ones, small ones, some of the towns, and that there's interaction between reserve communities and towns as well.
You go into city centers now, you go into the malls, to the schools, and you see the diversity. It's real. In the countryside, it's starting to get a little more diverse, but the country still has your population of your generational Saskatchewan people. Just to bring up, in 2018, when the Colton Boushie rendered its case decision, I was so thrown off at the reality that happened as a proud Saskatchewan person, as a proud First Nation person, and even the old neighbors of Cowessess First Nation in southeastern Saskatchewan, our store profits went down for a couple of weeks because non-Indigenous people didn't know, should I go on to the reserve, should I not? And I had my own First Nation people tell me, I'm scared, Chief, to travel, because if I run out of gas, do I go knock on that door now? And it really was a time in history for me to say, listen, we're talking the talk, but realistically, there is something we have to address, and that's the inequality, that's ignorance, and it all relates back to the topic that we're talking right now.
So you're talking about that the racial tension in the wake of that had, was coming from both sides, because we heard a lot about racial comments about directed at the Boushie family and that sort of thing. You're saying it worked the other way as well.
It from a perspective, I sit in here as a chief of Cowessess First Nation, as a proud First Nations person, and as someone who I like to say I could walk in both worlds, both as a chief and just as a proud Saskatchewan person. I sensed the realistic at that time of things people don't normally talk about. You could sense the uncomfortableness.
I think that there was a lot of fear and anger, and fear is really a powerful emotion, and it drives people to do things that that they might not want to do normally. Sorry, there was a little chat thing that came up. That I think that a lot of people, both Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous folks, afraid of the reaction that might happen, and just stereotypes that have built fear up. That fear can fuel anger, fear can fuel violence, fear can fuel like separation, rather than coming together and being able to really listen to each other. And so I think that we are living in a situation in which that's still a major factor in that's about building a wall instead of creating bridges where we can meet and learn together and figure out ways forward.
Yeah, I think we all felt the tension after the Colton Boushie verdict and after the shooting as well, right? I mean, it was a long time, and that's 2 years now. Where are we now? How big is have we moved forward a little bit, or how big of a problem is racism right now?
Yeah, I'll start on this one. I have this conversation many times. Is Saskatchewan, a racist province? Is Regina a racist city? I don't see it like that. I know there is judgment. I know there's ignorance, and there's even people ignorant of their ignorance when it comes to reality. I don't know if it's just a confidence in the way my parents raised me to just be too proud of an Indigenous person, but understand my role here in this province. Since the Colton Boushie time, lately since the Tristan, since even last year in the Stolen Children's Camp at the park, these highlight. And what upsets me is when I go on social media, when I listen to certain radio stations, it's as if people have to pick sides. And at the end of the day, we all go put our head on our pillow to the same land we share collectively. So, I just think it shouldn't be based as a picking sides. I'm standing on principle. It's about, are we going to just let the next generation figure this out? Are we going to just stop being ignorant of our ignorance? And, it goes a little bit of both ways, both sides. And, we just have to understand that we share this land collectively. Are we going to sentence another generation to figure this out? Or are we, as 2020 politicians, proud citizens, new Canadians, new Saskatchewanians, let's just have those uncomfortable conversations. Let's understand First Nations as rights holders have been here since time immemorial, and how do we, move collectively together?
Yeah, and I that would be very much the perspective that I would bring to this too, is that we need to find the ways forward together. And again, part of that is really understanding that we have a lot of systems based in colonial ideas, and that there needs to be a willingness to actually shine some light on them and see some change, because they're designed to exploit land and people for the benefit of a small group, and we are sharing this land, and we need to find the ways forward so that all of us can be living in harmony, living in prosperity for everybody, not just for some.
I want to cite the results from a recent poll that we ran last week. They asked people what the biggest issue in Saskatchewan was leading up to the provincial election. Like, obviously healthcare is always, very big, followed by the economy. Of course, there's a lot of concerns about the economy now, and education. And nobody cited racism per se. There was a very small number that cited civil rights, and another that's a small number that, like 2% that cited social issues, which of course could all be intertwined. How do you react to that? Is that just that racial issues cover a lot of different territory? Because of course there's economic issues and there's health issues, that sort of thing. How would you respond to those results?
That is how I would respond to it, is that we need to look at each of those big bucket areas, which are the major areas that our provincial budget goes to, right? Health and education and economic development. All of them, if we put an equity lens on them, but racial equality, gender equality, the abilities, like if we really look at if we look at any of those things through an equity and reflection lens, so that all of us are fully reflected as contributors in all of those areas, I think that would go a long way. So if we're not focusing on racism as it's in a box, but using it as a lens to look at a lot of other issues, I actually think that takes us further.
Mm-hmm. Racism is a behavior. Any child born is not born to be racist. It's taught. It's behavior that is watched in the homes. I find racism is almost like something that is just a blanket, and the mental health, the education, the economics is the drivers to move past it. I could sense the different generations. Anybody under the age of 21, I don't believe unless it's taught in their own home, they don't focus on racism as someone from the age of 22 to 54 who grew up in this great province in the 80s, 70s, 90s. And then you're 55 plus, the way education talked about the first people in those times, in those textbooks. So I just find racism is a behavior. And, I'm a believer that if every child wakes up and watches their parents get ready for work in the morning, we can stop child welfare almost in one generation. There's mental health there's jobs that are needed, education is needed. So I understand how polls would not really say racism is a high thing. It's because it's just so embedded in many. It's almost like a norm, and we have to start talking about those norms as we're doing right now.
And part of the racial equality issue, both in the States and here, has included defund the police or police reform. What are your views on that?
I'll go first. I see you looking. So, at Cowessess, I'm very proud to share that we have actively about 20 RCMP that are from Cowessess serving across this country. We have many that are in city police. My interactions as an individual with police has been respectively, neutral. I have seen and been in situations where I've been explained of how, some have felt that because they're Indigenous. I've never, had, a Black person come and talk to me about this, but I can only assume that they're probably in relation to it as to how they were treated and judged differently just because they were First Nation. And so, when that happens as a chief, I talk directly with Chief Evan Bray about it. I have talked directly with RCMP, F division in this province about it. And the role that I play in it is educating and reminding that, make sure that you understand the true history, make sure you understand the situations. And I'll give an example, gang life. Gang life is a lot of it stems because peer-to-peer group, the parent to youth group was taken away at the residential school times. And so a lot of these, gang members that I visited in jail, that I've tried to understand why, so I can help figure out how we could fix it. It all relates back to history. And so police are in a tough position. This province is in a tough position. But, when your main question about defunding the police and that, I think, we put too much onus on the police. I do believe they have to pick up their game in regards to a better understanding. But this is a mental health issue. This is a history issue. This is an ignorance issue. So there's so many within it.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple points in there that I would just bring up again to reiterate. I think that there are people in leadership positions in the police who recognize that there are real issues and are definitely working on them. Both, I also have a relationship with Evan Bray and with F Division, and that there is a real interest on building relationships with folks that often are targeted or distressed by interactions with the police. And I totally agree with Cadmus that we're asking the police to do things that they're really not trained for, and that we would be better off having other folks actually do. And I think that, the words defund the police sound really scary because it sounds like we're not going to give any funding to the police to run it all and they're going to be gone. That's not my understanding of the people who are behind those movements are saying. What they're saying is, let's make sure that the people and organizations that need to do some of the work that police aren't really meant to do have the resources and the training and the people and the ability to be called on immediately, so that they're the ones that go to a crisis situation and really are able to de-escalate it and not end up with somebody shot.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank both of you. That's all of our time this week. It was a very interesting discussion. I hope it sparks a few more discussions in the community and leading up to the provincial election. Again, thanks for taking part.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Good to see you, Cadmus.
Yeah.
Good to
And thanks to everyone for tuning in to Campaigniacs. We'll be back next week with some more analysis heading up to the provincial election.